Hello everyone, and welcome to part 1 of CSS Level 2. In this lecture, we're going to be learning about font properties of CSS, such as size, weight, text alignment, etc. And then we're also going to learn how to download and change fonts. When dealing with fonts, we have to keep in mind that not every OS has every font. And if you've used both a Windows computer and a Mac computer or a Linux computer often, you'll notice that when you're actually trying to use a file that was created on Windows, on a Mac, or vice versa, sometimes the fonts have to change. And what we're going to be doing is exploring that relationship, because sometimes we may need to actually provide the font for our website because the default font isn't available on a certain OS. Because of this, we're going to be exploring a few links. The first set of links is about OS support for certain fonts, so that's operating system support, so what fonts does Windows support, what fonts do Mac support, etc. And then the second set of links is actually going to cover how to download fonts. We'll be exploring two websites, a Google Fonts site and another site, to show you how you can download your own fonts from the internet or connect them using what's known as a CDN. Let's go ahead and start off just by showing some basic font properties with CSS in the editor, and then we'll hop over to the browser and check out how we can actually download fonts and check OS support for certain fonts. I'm going to hop to the editor now. Okay, so here I am at my editor, and I have two files open, a part1 fonts.css file and a part1 fonts.html file. And if you're looking for the completed version of these files, you can always check them out under the CSS Level 2 folder. Right now I have them blank, and we'll be coding through for this lecture. Let me collapse that directory. And you'll notice I also have my browser open and it's linked to my HTML file. What I first want to do is make some basic HTML. Hopefully by now you can actually do this quite quickly using Atom's built-in help. What I will do is add in a heading 1 here, H1, and we'll say this is something like heading 1, and then I'm going to add two paragraphs to this. First paragraph is just going to be lorem ipsum. Remember, that's that essentially filler Latin text, and luckily I can just begin to type LO, hit enter, and it automatically fills that in for me. And I will add in one more paragraph, but this paragraph is going to have an ID, so I can individually target it in the CSS file. We'll say ID is equal to 2, and then lorem ipsum. We'll save that, and let's refresh over here to make sure that's working. Great, we have heading 1, lorem ipsum, and then what I want to make sure I do is link my CSS file to my HTML file. Remember, that always happens in the head, so I will say link, and I can begin to type in link, hit enter here. The relationship is a style sheet, and the H reference is going to be whatever I call that style sheet. So in my case, it's called part1 underscore fonts. And as I mentioned previously in another lecture, it's a little unusual to have this sort of naming convention, especially if a digit inside the CSS file, but this is just so it matches up with the lecture notes. Okay. So everything looks good here. Let's explore some of the basics of fonts with CSS. So let's imagine that I actually want to change the font. Right now, it looks like it's in Times New Roman. That's essentially the default. If I want to change it to another font, maybe something like Arial, I can start typing font family. And that's going to allow me to then pass in a property of a different font. So we can see that there are some defaults here. These are very basic, so let's show you one of the defaults there. If I just say cursive, save this, and then refresh over here, I can see now I have some default cursive. It looks pretty ugly, but I can also pass in as a string, and that means that I'm wrapping it in either double quotes or single quotes, a font name that I'm familiar with. Maybe you've worked with a text editor before. Hopefully you're familiar with some font called Arial. So let me save that, refresh over here, and I can see now it's in Arial versus Times New Roman. All right, so that's the basics of a font family. But something we're going to have to keep in mind is not every font family is going to be defaulted on every OS. So certain fonts are really common between both OSs, such as Arial. It's in like 99% of Macs and 99% of Windows. But other font families, such as Helvetica, is really only existent on Macs, and maybe like less than 10% of Windows computers have that font. And we'll be discussing some websites that can help you choose fonts that will be available on both OSs, and later on we'll show you how to just download your own font so you can provide the font file yourself. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about font family. So as I mentioned, there are those basically default styles. So if I want something like monospace, I can do that as well for that paragraph. So let me refresh this here. And now I can see this is all done in monospace. Let's say I want to change the actual font size. Well, I can change the font size for everything in the body. And the way I do that is just say font-size, and here I can pass in pixels. So for instance, I can say I want it to be 10 pixels in size. Refresh over here, and I can see now it's in 10 pixels in size. 100 pixels in size, make it much larger. Now it's humongous. Okay, let's change it back to 10 pixels. Actually, let's do 20 pixels. And something to remember is I'm zoomed in here in my browser, so it may not look as large to you, so keep that in mind. Now, something you're probably wondering at this point in time is, well, what if I don't know the pixels I want for the font size? What if I actually want stuff to have a relationship between each other? So maybe I want the second paragraph to be twice as large as the basic font size on the page. How do we actually define that? And using pixels, as I've shown here, is actually not very common. What's more common is to use what are known as EM values. And EM values is a dynamic way of sizing things. So when you define the font size property, an EM is equal to the size of the font that applies to the parent of the element in question. And that basically means that if you haven't set the font size anywhere on the page, so let's say I delete this, and I haven't set the font size anywhere, so we can refresh here, that's the basic font size, then the browser default is often 16 pixels. So by default then, 1 EM, which would look like this, 1 EM, would be equal to 16 pixels. This is the default right here. Which means if I tell another tag to be 2EM, then it will be equal to 32 pixels, double that. And then you can get a relationship or a ratio for various tags in your HTML. What you'll usually do, however, is set a font size in the body element. So if we go back here, let's comment these out. Usually what you will end up doing is, for the body element, you will select a font size. And you will have it be some sort of default font size that you choose. You can do the 16 pixels, which is the same as the browser default where nothing's defined. But let's say font size is 20 pixels. And then from there on, for the other elements that you want to assign, you'll use EM, which is going to allow you to do a ratio of this, which is basically a ratio of the desired element pixel value divided by that parent element, which in this case is the body. So let's see just a quick example of this. I'm going to grab the number 2, remember that was the second paragraph, that's the ID, and state its font size is equal to 2.0 EM. Let's save that. We'll refresh over here, and now I can see that we have heading 1, the first paragraph, and now the second paragraph is twice as large in font size as the first one. So what you're doing here is you're stating some default body font size, and then from there, you can actually call the ID font size as a ratio of it. What you should avoid doing is trying to actually call something like H1 and make it mimic the font size of a paragraph, or vice versa. Try to make a paragraph as large and as bold enough so that it looks like an H1, a heading 1. That's really not the point of this. The point of this is that on your page, if you have two elements of the same type, but you want one to be a little larger, a little smaller than the other one, then you start calling EM. What you don't want to do is call EM to the point where you should have just called heading 1 or heading 2 since the very beginning. So keep that in mind. And then what I want to show you now is font styles and font weights, as well as text alignment. So if I call a paragraph here and say font style of paragraph, and let me change this font size again to 1.0, that way everything's the same. Okay, looks good. I'll say font style here is italic. So I can save this, and now when I refresh my page, I can see that everything is italicized. So you can call font styles for basic things in that manner. And you can also call things such as font weight, and that can be things such as bold, lighter, normal, 100, 200, etc. Not every font is going to have every possible font weight. It really depends on what font you download and what font you use, and we'll be talking about that in a future lecture. But we have font weight is bold, so let's save that and make this both italic and bold. And here I can see when I refresh, now they're in bold. And finally, I want to talk about text properties. So if we see H1, one of the properties you're going to be using all the time is the text alignment property. And you can begin to write text dash, and you'll see Adam trying to help you out with various text properties. We've already actually seen text decoration. Remember, that was stuff like underline, overline, line through. What we want to do is talk about text align. And text align basically allows you to center something, justify it to the left, to the right, etc. So if I want to center heading 1, I just say text align center on that element. So I will save that, refresh my page over here, and I can see now heading 1 is aligned to be center. Great. Okay, we're going to be talking a lot more about alignments and how alignments work with mobile devices when we talk about Bootstrap. But for right now, what I want you to get out of this lecture is the following: that you can call font families, have some awareness of that some fonts don't work on every OS, and we'll be talking about that in the very next lecture as a continuation of this series. Then you can call font families for very basic things such as monospace, or some of the other options if we take a look, or things such as cursive or serif or sans serif. We can save that as well. Then for font size, what I want you to make sure you get out of this lecture is that you can call a pixel, but what you should probably do is call an EM based off the default for the body. Then you can call font styles and font weights, as well as do text alignment. All right, thanks everyone. And in the next lecture, we're going to be continuing this part 1 discussion of fonts and talking about what fonts work with which OS, how you can figure that out, and how you can download your own font from the internet to use it for your website. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture.